we're going to think about a situation where I am driving 65 miles per hour. Here's knowing when we have our labels, knowing exactly what those labels mean. 65 miles per hour means I drive 5 miles in every hour. So if I'm filling out my table, I know that I'm going to go 65 miles for the... I should be able to go in 2 hours, I should be able to do 65 miles in the first hour, 65 miles in the second hour, give me a grand total of 130 miles. Another way I could think about that, if I'm taking 65 miles in 2 hours, I could take 65 times 2, which would be drawing my original, times 2, how many miles I would do in 2 hours. I could do the same thing after 3. In 3 hours, I would travel 65, 65, and 65, which would equal to 65 times 3. To give me a grand total of 195 miles traveled after 3 hours. After 4 hours, it's another 65 miles, so that means 65 times 4, which equals 260. I'm going to keep this pattern up. 65 times 5, 325. 65 times 6, 390. So that tells me if I'm going 65 miles an hour and I travel for 6 hours straight, I can do 65 times 6 to get 390 to figure out how many miles I'll travel in that amount of time. Now we're going to start to generate an equation with this. What it's going to take and we really need to look at is what was I doing? What was my constant? What was really happening every single time I was doing this? What categories were working together? I remember I had my variables of hours and miles. How were hours and miles working together to give me my answer? Well, it really comes down to what was staying constant and what was changing. Every single time, 65 times 1, times 2, times 3, times 4, times 5, times 6. Every single time, 65 was a huge part of my equation. In order to find out how far I traveled, I needed to know how far I could travel in 1 hour and then extrapolate that out into other hours. So now I could take 65 times the number of hours, whether that be 1 hour, 2 hours, 6 hours, 12 hours, 15 hours, whatever. I can always take 65 times the number of hours to find the number of miles. So we can start to say that in words, now we're going to put those words into a formula, into an equation. Because now what I said, I could take 65 times any number of hours h. H could stand for 15, 18, 37, whatever, as many hours as you need to. I can always take 65 times the number of hours. That will always equal how far I traveled. So now my equation is 65 times h equals mi. I could take any value of h, plug it into this value here. And so if it was 3, I could take 65 times 3, and I would be able to get my answer, which I think we said last time was 195. In order to find out 4 hours, I could just plug in 4 into my equation. Now I'm taking 65. If h is 4, then I'm taking 65 times 4 to get 260 miles, which we found on the last page. So every single time I can put in my different hour value in for h and get my new mile value, which I'll put into my table. So I'm always taking 65, my constant, multiplied by hours, which was a variable, because it always changed every single time. None of my hours were always the same. 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, they always changed, therefore they're a variable. And that equaled miles, which was my other variable, because that was always changing. And my miles was my dependent variable, because I was always depending on how many hours I had. 65 times the number of hours affected how many miles I was going to do. So this is definitely my dependent variable, because it's dependent on the number of hours, making this my independent variable. So that would be x-axis, this on the y. Oh, I'm sorry, I said that exactly backwards. This on the, I'll do this in blue. This on the dependent on the y, because it depends on the other variable, and the independent on the x. I misspoke. So now we're taking a look, and we have our equation 65 times h equals m. we have our table filled in. When seeing that my 65 is always my constant because it's the same every single time. That number never changes. And then I would work with my other two variables, miles and hours, to fill in my chart. And that's how we come up with equations.